A stark warning from Caroline Kennedy to U.S. senators about her cousin, RFK Jr., who she does not think should be confirmed as Health and Human Services Secretary.
I've known Bobby my whole life. We grew up together. It's no surprise that he keeps birds of prey as pets, because Bobby himself is a predator.
She wrote this letter to a group of senators and alleges that her cousin is, quote, addicted to power, has given hypocritical advice on vaccines, led family members, quote, down the path of addiction, and describes disturbing scenes at the places where he's lived.
His basement, his garage, his dorm room were always the center of the action, where drugs were available, and he enjoyed showing off how he put baby chickens and mice in a blender to feed to his hawks. It was often a perverse scene of despair and violence.
Let's bring in the reporter who broke this story, Jacqueline Alemany of The Washington Post. Mark McKinnon is also with us, former advisor to George W. Bush and John McCain and creator of The Circus. So, Jacqueline, I don't ever remember reading a letter quite like this. Help us understand some more of the things that are in here and why she ultimately decided to write this letter.
Yeah, Chris, thanks so much for having me this afternoon. This was a pretty searing and devastating letter that Caroline Kennedy, the former ambassador to Australia under former President Biden, sent to Democratic and Republican lawmakers who are going to be confronted with her cousin's nomination hearings starting tomorrow and on Thursday, essentially warning them, advising them to vote against her cousin. She, as you know, was reluctant to get involved in this conversation. She did not comment on RFK's politics or involvement with his own campaign and the Trump presidential campaign during the campaign period. She very reluctantly commented on RFK's politics as it relates to vaccines and the public health sector at an event in Australia in November. But as she lays out in this letter to lawmakers, she did not want to get involved in having to discuss the lives and challenges that her family members face, but felt compelled to do so because of how well she knows RFK and what she knows about public health as well, having served and participated in some of the public efforts around vaccination and public health. She not only lists some of his challenges early on in his career, but says that he is essentially, she calls him a hypocrite for advocating that families of sick children not vaccinate their children while his children are vaccinated. She also says that he seeks to enrich himself through propagating some of these anti-vaccine beliefs, such as refusing to recuse himself from a lawsuit that he's filed against the HPV vaccine, citing a New York Times report that the Washington Post has not independently confirmed. But there are a list of things she goes through in this letter about why exactly she opposes the nomination. It might not necessarily dissuade any Republicans, but there were a few Democrats who were on the fence that could really firm up opposition from them.
She does point out in this letter, Mark, that there are 28 cousins, and obviously both she and RFK Jr.'s dads were assassinated. They share that. And there's another part of the letter that I found particularly telling. She writes, Bobby continues to grandstand off my father's assassination and that of his own father. It is incomprehensible that someone who is willing to exploit their own painful family tragedies for publicity would be in charge of American life and death situations. It does go on, including much of what was explained by Jacqueline. But let me ask you, do you see this having an impact?
I really don't. I mean, it's no surprise to anybody that the Kennedy family is across the board opposed to Robert Kennedy's nomination. But that's why he's such a prized asset for the Republican Party. This would be like a member of the Bush family being in the Biden cabinet. The question is, will it have any effect on confirmation? And the fact is, it's certainly not going to have an impact on any Republicans. In fact, just the opposite. There is the notion that there could be some Democrats out there willing to vote for Kennedy. But I don't see that any of the information is particularly new. I mean, it's new that Caroline Kennedy's coming out and being so vocal, but there's nothing in that letter, at least that I heard, that's particularly newsworthy in terms of information that we didn't already know about Robert Kennedy. The thing that I find interesting is that abortion policy is not just a big health policy for Republicans. It's like the biggest major policy initiative across the board of anything that Republicans care about. So you'd think that that would be a mitigating factor in support for Kennedy. And yet there's not a single Republican pro-life organization, with the exception of the one that Mike Pence leads, that's come out against Robert Kennedy. And even very pro-life senators have said they're satisfied with Kennedy's remarks, that he may have had differences in the past, but he is 100% across the board in alignment with Donald Trump's policies on this issue.
You did mention that conservative advocacy group that is headed by Mike Pence, and they actually just today put an ad out. Let me play a little bit of that.
RFK Jr. is a Democrat plant, a radical left liberal. A lot of people think that Jr. is a conservative. He's not. He's more liberal than anybody running on the Democrat side.
So whatever, 6-7 months ago, they're playing what Donald Trump had to say very disparagingly against RFK Jr. back then. But I think to your point about abortion, and there were a lot of folks when Kennedy was first elected who thought, well, his pro-abortion stance will tank him with conservatives. What do you really think changed? Or is this just we're going to give Donald Trump what he wants?
Well, I think that people have looked at the other confirmation process, and they've realized that if they don't get on board, there's going to be consequences. Trump has made that very clear. But I think they also really like the idea of having the most iconic name in Democratic history, Kennedy, on the Trump team. I mean, they love that notion. And of course, his vaccine background is absolute alignment. By the way, it's interesting today to see that it was reported that in Kansas, the largest tuberculosis outbreak in history just was reported. So it's interesting what's happening on the vaccine front. But again, that's very much in alignment with MAGA voters, and I think a lot of them like that and are willing to put aside his past history on abortion just for that reason.
Jacqueline Alemany, great reporting as always. Mark McKinnon, always good to have you on the program. Thanks to both of you.